Walter Briggs had his routines: coffee at 6 a.m., wood chopped before lunch, long walks through snow-blanketed trails with a dog who never needed a leash. His granddaughter, Emily, didn't understand the silence he wrapped himself in, and he never tried to explain. But then strange things began to happen. Shadow stopped sleeping. He waited at the door, and every morning, something new was tied to his collar: a feather, a carved twig, a loop of dried vine. They seemed like nothing at first, until they led Walter into a blizzard, and into something that would change all their lives. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The wind moved like a whisper through the tall, bare trees of Cades Cove, Tennessee. Winter had settled over the Smoky Mountains, wrapping the world in a soft blanket of silence and frost. Snow still clung to the corners of rooftops and low pine branches, though the sun had managed to pierce the cold with a thin, golden light that spilled across the narrow gravel road leading to a forgotten cabin at the edge of the forest. Inside that cabin lived Walter Briggs. Walter was 72, lean and wiry, the kind of man who once carved paths through wilderness with nothing but a compass and a stubborn heart. His shoulders were slightly hunched, not from age, but from the weight of quiet grief that had rested there since his wife died 6 years ago. He had the kind of face that never looked surprised. Leathery skin weathered by decades of sun. A sharp jawline beneath a gray beard always kept short, and pale green eyes that once scanned forest canopies for eagles, now fixed mostly on the floor. Walter used to be a park ranger. He spent 35 years working these woods, tending to wildfires, lost hikers, and injured animals. But retirement didn't bring him peace, it brought silence. He wasn't entirely alone. His companion was a dog named Shadow. Shadow was a 6-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt sienna, streaked with ash gray along the spine. One ear always stood higher than the other, a relic from an old injury during his time as a trainee in a search and rescue K-9 program. Though he'd shown early promise. A training accident that left a long scar along his front leg had sidelined him. Too unpredictable, they'd said, might not perform under stress. So, Shadow was discharged before he ever had a mission. Walter, who had volunteered part-time with the program after retiring, had taken the dog home without a second thought. Since then, they'd been each other's only real company. Shadow moved with purpose, always alert but never anxious, his eyes bright but unreadable. He didn't bark unnecessarily, didn't jump or whine, and he seemed to sense Walter's moods before they were spoken. His loyalty was unquestioned, a quiet soldier without a war. That morning, the sky had cleared after 3 days of sleet. The air was clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and wet bark. Walter put on his flannel coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and stepped out onto the creaking porch. Shadow followed, his paw prints overlapping Walter's in the snow. Down the slope behind the cabin ran an old trail, barely visible in winter. Walter still walked it every other day, not out of habit, but because it was the only rhythm left in his life. Emily had arrived 3 nights ago, and it had thrown off that rhythm. Emily was Walter's granddaughter, 14 years old, long-legged and awkward in the way children are when they're becoming something else. Her hair was a mess of chestnut curls usually pulled into a loose ponytail, and her eyes wide, brown, constantly guarded, had inherited a look of quiet rebellion. She wore oversized hoodies, one earbud always in, and answered most questions with a shrug. Her mother, Walter's daughter, had sent her here for the winter break, though Walter suspected it was something more complicated than that. Trouble at school. Maybe worse. They barely spoke. Walter didn't know how to talk to her, not anymore. She didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer stories. She spent most of her time holed up in the spare bedroom, staring at her phone, headphones turned up to block out the world. Still, she was here. And Walter didn't know whether that made him feel comforted or exposed. By mid-morning, the trail was hard beneath his boots. He carried a small axe on his back, more out of habit than need, and Shadow trotted a few paces ahead, nose low to the ground. Birds had not yet returned from their southern flight, and the forest felt like a cathedral of bare bones and silence. That's when Shadow froze. Walter stopped, one hand on the axe handle, eyes narrowing, the dog's ears tilted forward, and his body tensed like a bowstring. Walter followed his gaze, there, just off the trail. Something moved under the scrub of frozen grass. It was a doe, thin, trembling, and breathing shallowly. Her left hind leg was twisted unnaturally, caught in a steel snare that dug deep into flesh. Blood had darkened the snow beneath her. The trap was old, illegal in these parts, probably forgotten by some poacher long gone. The animal lifted her head at their approach, eyes wild with panic. Walter raised a hand. "Stay," he whispered to Shadow, though the dog had already lowered into a slow crouch, his body language cautious but focused. Walter took a step forward, but the doe's chest heaved, her breath coming in fast puffs of steam. She tried to pull away, but the trap held. "I'll scare her if I get too close," Walter muttered. Shadow glanced back at him, and then, without command, the dog moved forward. He stepped carefully, head low, his movements fluid and deliberate. The doe did not lash out. She flinched as Shadow approached, but didn't struggle further. There was something oddly reverent about it. Shadow reached the trap, sniffed at it, and began pawing gently. His teeth found the wire, pulling carefully at the twisted metal. It took minutes. Walter watched, awestruck, with a final jerk. The trap sprang loose. The wire fell away, and the doe screamed. A terrible, brief sound. She struggled to her feet, took a few limping steps, and then ran, slowly, awkwardly, but free. She didn't look back. Walter exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Shadow returned to his side, tail wagging slightly, his muzzle stained red with effort. Walter knelt beside him, hand on his back. "Good boy," he murmured. "You did more with your teeth than I ever could with my hands." The dog pressed close, and for a brief second, Walter felt something break open inside him, a fissure where the cold had settled for too long. They walked home through the trees in silence. The rain began just after sunset. Soft at first, tapping against the rusted metal roof of Walter's cabin like cautious fingers. The air, already damp with mountain chill, grew sharper as the temperature dipped. By nightfall, the rain had turned to sleet, the wind slicing in from the ridgeline like a blade. In the distance, low thunder rumbled, echoing across the Smoky Mountains like the growl of something ancient. Inside the cabin, a fire cracked in the hearth, casting golden light on the wooden floor and the soft silhouette of Emily, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book she hadn't really been reading. Her hair, now dry from her earlier walk with Walter, spilled in unkempt curls across her shoulders. She looked up occasionally, eyeing the corner where Shadow usually laid. But tonight, the space was empty. "Where's your dog?" she asked after a while. Her voice, cutting through the silence like a pebble, dropped in still water. Walter sat at the kitchen table, a half-carved block of cedar in his hands, the scent of wood and lemon oil filling the air. He didn't look up. "Should be back by now," he muttered. "Went out before dark. He always comes back before the storm hits." Emily frowned. She set the book aside and moved to the window, wiping a foggy pane with her sleeve. Outside, the darkness pressed against the glass, thick and formless, broken only by the pale shimmer of sleet under the porch light. Another hour passed. Walter put down the carving knife, stood, and slipped on his coat. "Stay inside," he said, already reaching for the lantern. "If he's not back in 10 minutes, I'll go look." Emily hesitated, then grabbed her own coat. "I'm coming too." Walter shot her a glance. "It's a freezing rain out there." "I know." She zipped the jacket higher. "But he's the only one around here who doesn't make me feel like a ghost." That silenced Walter. He nodded once, grabbed an extra flashlight, and opened the door. The cold hit them like a wave. The forest looked different at night, less like a living thing, more like a waiting one. The sleet hissed through the air, bouncing off leaves and frozen soil. They followed the faint path down the slope, boots crunching over wet gravel and patches of ice. Walter called for Shadow in a low voice, careful not to raise it too loud. Emily stayed close, her gloved hand clutching the strap of her flashlight. Then they saw him, at the edge of the tree line, illuminated by a flash of lightning. Shadow stood still as a statue. His fur was soaked, matted to his ribs, his eyes glowing faintly in the beam of the light. Something hung from his collar, a thin strand of vine wrapped tightly around a broken twig. Walter narrowed his eyes. "What the hell is that?" Emily stepped forward, ignoring his warning. She crouched in front of Shadow and carefully untangled the object from his neck. It was a small branch, no longer than her finger, snapped cleanly at both ends. Around its middle was a single loop of dried grapevine, tied not haphazardly, but in a deliberate knot, almost decorative. There were 2 tiny marks on the bark, parallel, like teeth. "This didn't just fall onto him," Emily said quietly. Walter took the branch, turning it over in his hands. It smelled faintly of wild mint and damp soil. He looked at Shadow. The dog didn't move. His body was tense, ears forward, nose twitching toward the deeper woods. "He wants us to follow him," Emily whispered. Walter didn't respond immediately. He was staring into the woods now, heart drumming against his ribs. Something about the way Shadow stood there, unmoving, insistent, stirred an old instinct in him. Not fear, recognition. "All right," he said at last, "but we stay together." Shadow took off into the trees, slow at first, then faster. They followed. The sleet turned to snow, fat, wet flakes that clung to their eyelashes and coated the forest floor in a shimmering crust. Emily stumbled once, but Walter caught her arm. They didn't speak. The only sound was the wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. After 10 minutes, Shadow stopped again. They had reached a narrow clearing nestled between tall, ancient pines. The snow here was untouched, a perfect white canvas, except for a circle in the center where something had been disturbed. Shadow circled the area once and then sat down, eyes fixed on Walter. Emily moved to the center of the clearing. She knelt, brushing snow aside. There, half buried beneath a thin drift, was another branch, this one longer, carved with shallow grooves that twisted in elegant spirals. Another vine loop was tied to one end, and tucked beneath it was a feather. Not just any feather, thick, black and white, from a hawk or a large owl. It's like a gift, Emily said. Walter remained silent, his thoughts tumbling over each other like logs in a river. The pattern of the grooves, the placement of the vine, the feather. It wasn't random. Someone, or something, had placed it with intention. A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, and Shadow stood abruptly, tail stiff. Then a sound, faint but distinct, rose from the deeper woods beyond the clearing. It was a howl, not from a wolf, from the wind, perhaps. But then again, perhaps not. Emily shivered. Should we go back? Walter nodded slowly. Yeah, we've seen enough for tonight. Shadow led the way home, glancing back only once, back at the cabin. The storm intensified. Snow fell thick and fast, and the roof groaned under its weight. Emily sat by the fire, the carved branch and feather cradled in her lap like something sacred. Walter watched her from across the room, something uneasy stirring beneath his ribs. He turned to Shadow, who lay stretched before the hearth, his eyes half closed but alert. You found something out there, Walter murmured. Shadow didn't respond. He didn't need to. The wind had not rested since nightfall. By morning, the snow lay thick and heavy across the Smoky Mountains, swallowing the trails and covering the trees in a dense shroud of silence. The forest looked like a world erased. Every landmark softened into nothing but white and shadow. Walter Briggs trudged through the deepening snow, his coat crusted with ice, his breath coming in labored clouds. Emily walked beside him, her cheeks flushed red, and her scarf pulled up to just below her eyes. Shadow trotted ahead, leading them deeper into the woods, his body low to the ground, ears sharply tuned to every sound beyond the storm. They had set out before dawn. After a sleepless night in the cabin, Shadow had not rested. He had stood by the door, growling low, eyes focused on the trees beyond the clearing as though something, or someone, was calling to him. Walter, trusting the dog's instincts, had agreed to go. He and Emily layered up, packed emergency supplies, and followed their silent guide back into the forest, into the heart of a storm that showed no signs of mercy. Now, nearly 2 hours later, the path ahead vanished beneath undisturbed snow. The world was white in wind and the crunch of boots. Shadow suddenly stopped, ears pricking, body tense. He let out a short bark, not loud but sharp, then turned left off the trail they'd been following and bounded into a stand of oak trees. Walter's gut clenched. He's found something. Emily nodded silently and followed. They reached a clearing framed by tall oaks and drift-laden pines. Shadow had stopped beneath one massive tree, its black branches stretching like skeletal arms overhead. He sniffed the ground, pawed furiously at a drift of snow, then barked again, sharper, more insistent. Walter pushed forward and dropped to his knees beside the dog. "Help me," he said, already scooping snow away. Emily dropped beside him without a word. Together, they dug, hands numb, hearts pounding, within moments. Walter's hand struck something soft, cloth, a jacket, then another. Fingers, small, blue from cold. 2 children were buried beneath the snow. A girl, older, curled around a younger boy, their bodies half hidden beneath pine boughs and makeshift brush, like someone had tried to shield them. The girl's eyes were closed, her face pale, lips blue. The boy wasn't moving. Emily gasped. "Are they—" Walter pressed 2 fingers gently to the girl's neck. "She's got a pulse," he said, voice tight, weak, but it's there. He reached for the boy, gently shaking his shoulder. "Come on, kid." A tiny cough, then another. The boy's chest rose in a trembling breath. Walter exhaled in relief. "We've got them!" Emily's hands moved fast. She unzipped her coat and wrapped it around the girl's upper body. "She's freezing." She leaned closer. "Can you hear me? What's your name?" The girl stirred slightly. Her lips parted. "Ava," she whispered. "My brother. Logan." Walter nodded. "That's them, from the flyer, the Barton kids." He remembered the details, a family camping trip cut short when the kids wandered off after a deer. The mother, injured in the search, had been airlifted out. The weather turned bad, search teams called off. Everyone had assumed the worst. Walter pulled Logan into his arms, his own body heat already radiating into the boy's limp frame. Emily helped Ava to her feet, draping her own arms around the trembling girl. Shadow stood beside them, his tail still, his eyes steady. They began the long journey back. Snow fell heavier now, blurring the path behind them, soaking their clothes, biting at their skin. Walter's arms ached from carrying the boy, but he never stopped. Emily kept Ava close, whispering soft encouragements. At one point, she tripped and nearly fell, but Shadow darted back and bumped her upright with his shoulder. It took nearly 3 hours to reach the cabin. When they burst through the door, the sudden warmth nearly knocked them off balance. Walter carried Logan to the hearth and lay him on a thick bed of blankets. Emily did the same for Ava. The fire roared, throwing dancing shadows across the floor. Steam rose from their soaked clothes. Walter moved like a man possessed, heating water, wrapping towels, checking pulses. He'd seen cases like this before. Minutes mattered. Ava began to shiver violently, a good sign. Logan's eyelids fluttered. Emily knelt beside them both, whispering quietly. After some time, Ava managed to speak more clearly. "Where's my mom?" Walter crouched beside her. "She's safe. She's at the hospital. We'll get word to her soon, I promise." The girl nodded, her lips trembling not from cold this time, but from relief. Emily looked over at her grandfather, her voice soft. "You knew what to do." Walter met her eyes, and for the first time, they both let their walls down. He reached up and wiped a trembling hand across his face. The lines beside his eyes were deeper now, and not just from age. "You were crying," Emily whispered. He didn't look away. Sometimes you have to. She didn't answer, but the way she moved closer, just a little, said enough. Shadow lay down near the door, head resting on his front paws, watching the family unfold before him. That night, the storm outside grew louder, but inside, life had returned. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the landscape drenched in golden silence. Sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, catching the snow-laden trees in a slow shimmer, as if the forest had taken a deep, cleansing breath. The sky above Cades Cove was pale and clear, and for the first time in days, the wind had gone still. Inside the cabin, warmth hummed from the hearth. Logan and Ava, still wrapped in thick quilts, were beginning to stir more fully now. Their small voices carried across the room in murmured questions and soft laughter. Emily sat beside them, patiently feeding Ava warm broth, while Logan worked the stiffness out of his legs under a mountain of blankets. The firelight danced on their faces, replacing the hollow grayness of the night before. Walter stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun climb higher above the ridgelines. A shadow crossed the clearing, then another. He squinted. Moments later, a sharp knock echoed at the door. "Sheriff's here," he said quietly. The door opened, and Sheriff Dana Crowley stepped inside. a woman in her late 50s. Sheriff Crowley had the build of someone who'd grown up working the land, square-shouldered, with weathered hands and calm, heavy eyes that missed very little. Her thick black parka, dusted with snow, hung open over a gray flannel shirt and worn jeans. Her dark brown hair, streaked with silver, was tied back in a low, functional bun. She offered Walter a nod. "Heard you found the Barton kids. They're here," Walter said. "Alive, thanks to the dog." Crowley turned her gaze to Shadow, who lay near the hearth, tail flicking slightly but eyes alert. That's him, Emily said from the floor. Glancing up, his name's Shadow. Crowley looked at Walter. "I'm gonna need your statement. And I'll call their parents soon as I'm back in range. Rescue team's been grounded for 3 days. We thought they were lost." Walter gave a slow nod. They nearly were. Crowley crouched near the children, keeping her tone soft. "You two okay?" Hungry Ava nodded. Logan blinked, his voice raspy. "He saved us. The dog. He found us." Crowley gave a small, rare smile. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real hero," as the sheriff radioed her dispatcher from her truck outside. Walter returned to the fireplace, stoking the flame. Emily stood beside him, the soft crinkle of something in her hands. He noticed the envelope just before she spoke. "I found this in the drawer by the bed," she said. "It's for me. From Grandma." Walter's face tightened, but he said nothing. Emily unfolded the letter with both hands, the old paper trembling slightly. She read it silently, lips moving just enough to follow the words. Then, slowly, she looked up. "You never told me you used to be a ranger," she said. Walter set the iron poker down, his voice low. "Didn't think it mattered. She said you were brave, that you once carried a man 3 miles out of a gorge during a flash flood, that you saved people." Walter turned slightly, his eyes drifting to the window. "She also said something changed after Shadow was discharged. She said you never forgave yourself." Walter remained still for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. It wasn't just about the dog, he said. Shadow. He was good, too good, passed every mark, but one day, during a training drill, there was a noise, loud and close. He flinched, just once, just for a second. He paused. They dropped him from the program, called him unreliable, and I didn't fight it. I just took him home, and I stopped going back. Emily's voice was quiet. "You blamed yourself." Walter nodded. "I told myself I'd taught him wrong, that I'd failed him. And when your grandma passed, I didn't have much left to hold on to. I pulled away from everyone, including your mom, including you." Emily didn't speak for a moment. Then she stepped closer. "But you didn't fail him," she said. "He saved those kids, and maybe he saved you too." Walter looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't a child anymore, not after these past few days, the weight in her eyes, the steadiness in her voice. She had grown in the shadow of snow and storm. Shadow stirred at their feet and came to sit between them, his eyes flicking up at Walter. There was no judgment in them, only quiet presence. Later that afternoon, a rescue vehicle pulled up the path, and 2 paramedics came to check the children. Emily helped Ava into the back seat, while Walter lifted Logan in gently. Sheriff Crowley gave Walter one last look before she climbed into her truck. "We'll call when they're reunited with their folks," she said. "I told the news crews to stay the hell away, but word's already spreading." Walter gave a dry smile. Let them say what they want. As the engines roared to life and pulled away, the cabin returned to quiet. That night, Emily sat on the porch while Walter carved a new piece of wood beside her. Not furniture this time, but something smaller, a dog's head, ears high, eyes steady. "I think Grandma knew this would happen," Emily said softly. Walter looked up. "What makes you say that?" She ended her letter with this: "Someday, the storm will come, and when it does, Shadow will find you again." Walter said nothing, but his eyes softened. The stars came out slowly, one by one, over the quiet woods. A soft breeze rippled through the town of Townsend, Tennessee, carrying the scent of pine and firewood through its narrow streets. Snow still clung to the higher ridgelines, but in the valley below, winter had begun to loosen its grip. The sun shone brighter, days stretched a little longer, and there was a warmth to the air that hadn't been felt since October. Along the edge of the woods, banners swayed gently in the wind, white cloth embroidered with flickering golden threads. The words "Light in the Pines" were painted in hand-lettered script on the archway leading into the town square. It had been exactly 1 month since the rescue. Walter Briggs stood at the edge of the crowd, dressed in his best flannel, which still bore a faint stain of linseed oil near the cuffs. His boots were polished, though scuffed at the toes. A fresh shave had taken years off his face, but the stoop in his shoulders remained, not from grief this time, but from humility. He was not used to being the center of anything. Beside him, Emily adjusted the collar of her wool coat. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and there was a quiet confidence in her posture that hadn't been there before. She carried a small wooden plaque wrapped in cloth beneath one arm. Shadow sat between them, his thick coat brushed and gleaming in the sun. A simple bandana, forest green, stitched with his name, was tied around his neck. At 6 years old, Shadow looked every inch the part he had come to represent, a creature of strength, patience, and instinct. He watched the gathering crowd with calm eyes, not wagging, not whining, simply present. The square had been transformed. Folding chairs lined the perimeter, and wooden stalls sold handmade goods, candles, carved ornaments, jars of spiced jam. Children darted between the trees with paper lanterns, and the scent of cinnamon donuts filled the air. The townsfolk had come together in a way that surprised even the mayor, Mayor Howard Lane. A broad-shouldered man in his late 60s with a white mustache and suspenders always tugged a little too tight, had organized the event with a firm but generous hand. Howard was a retired history teacher known for 2 things: his deep, booming laugh and his insistence on community. When he heard about what had happened in the mountains, he'd gone door to door, calling volunteers, scribbling ideas on napkins, and pushing past every bureaucratic snag like a man who refused to let red tape stand in the way of tribute. Now, standing on the makeshift stage under the pines, Mayor Lane tapped the mic. "Folks," he said, his voice warm and crackling through the speakers, "there's been a lot of talk lately about courage, about kindness, about the ties that bind us, and while we've gathered today to celebrate a dog who saved 2 lives, I'd argue that what we're really here to celebrate is the idea that none of us are truly alone, even when we think we are." He gestured toward Walter. This man, quiet as he may be, stepped forward when he didn't have to, but more than that, the creature beside him did something that most of us would call impossible. And that, my friends, is where we begin today. Applause broke out. Walter shifted uneasily. Mayor Lane beckoned him to the stage. Walter climbed the steps slowly, pausing just once to glance at Shadow, who remained by Emily's side when he reached the microphone. He cleared his throat and adjusted his cap. His voice, when it came, was deep, steady, and a little rough around the edges. "I didn't come here to be honored," he began. "And I'm not sure I deserve to be. I spent years pulling away from people. From life. Really. But this dog, he didn't let me, not when it mattered." The crowd leaned in. Shadow wasn't trained to rescue anyone, not officially, but he watched. He listened. He knew, and in the coldest moment of this winter, the moment when I'd convinced myself that nothing I did mattered anymore, he found something, and he brought us to it. Walter's voice cracked slightly. He saved those kids, but more than that, he saved me. And I think he reminded all of us that trust isn't lost forever. It just needs a reason to come back. The crowd stood silent, the only sound the soft rustle of wind in the high branches. Walter stepped back. Emily walked forward next, carrying the plaque. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a smooth piece of maple wood, sanded and stained, with carved lettering that caught the sunlight. Shadow, the guide who found us all. She turned to Walter and pressed it into his hands. He took it without speaking, staring at the words as if they were something sacred. Behind them, 2 volunteers pulled the cover off a new wooden statue placed beside the archway that led into the forest trail. It was a life-size carving of Shadow, upright, attentive, his ears perked, gaze fixed on something just beyond the visible. The craftsmanship was delicate and precise, down to the faint scarring on his leg and the texture of his fur. At the base of the sculpture was a small bronze plate with the same words as the plaque. People clapped, cheered. Some even wiped their eyes. Later, as dusk began to fall and lanterns flickered in the trees, Emily and Walter stood before the statue. Shadow sat between them, his gaze now turned toward the woods. He always liked this trail. Walter said quietly, "I think he was waiting for something." Emily added. Walter nodded, and he found it. The festival began to fade, and the people drifted home. But the statue remained, a sentinel at the edge of the forest. And Shadow, the dog who had once been cast aside as unreliable, had become something more than just a companion. He had become legend. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come on 4 paws, quietly walking into the storm when others turn back. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a vessel of something higher. A reminder that God still works through the humble, the broken, and the forgotten when Walter had lost his faith in himself and the world. It was through Shadow that grace returned, not in grand speeches or fire from heaven, but in a silent rescue, a warm fire, and a girl who finally understood the heart of her grandfather. In our daily lives, we often overlook the small signs, the gentle nudges, the quiet moments of connection, where love, faith, and purpose are trying to reach us. But stories like this remind us that God is always speaking. We just have to listen. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment below with Amen if you believe that animals can be angels in disguise. Subscribe for more stories of healing, love, and miracles. And may God bless and protect everyone watching this.